The air in the M4 Sherman tank was thick with the metallic tang of sweat, stale rations, and the acrid scent of fear. Outside, the Austrian countryside, moments before a canvas of vibrant spring green, was now a grim tableau of smoldering farmhouses and the skeletal remains of trees. For Sergeant Jack Riley, commander of the lead tank, the silence that had fallen was more unnerving than the cacophony of battle. It was May 5th, 1945, a date that had whispered promises of an end, but for his company, it was just another day of wading through the dying embers of a war that refused to extinguish itself. They were pushing through a valley that maps had barely bothered to acknowledge, a forgotten fold in the Alps, supposedly cleared of any significant German presence. But the silence was a lie. Every instinct honed by 2 years of brutal combat screamed that something was wrong. The usual scattered snipers, the opportunistic ambushes, the desperate pockets of resistance, they were all absent. It was too quiet, too clean. "Anything, Miller?" Jack rasped into the intercom, his voice rough. "Nothing but the damned wind, Sarge," came the reply from his gunner, a lanky kid from Kansas who'd seen too much for his 19 years. "It's like the whole damn country just packed up and left." Jack grunted, his knuckles white on the steering levers. He'd learned to distrust quiet. Quiet often meant a trap. They'd been tasked with a reconnaissance mission to push ahead of the main advance and secure any remaining German positions in this remote region. The intelligence was sketchy, as it always was in these final, chaotic days. Rumors of SS units digging in, of fanatical holdouts, of something else. Something whispered in hushed tones by terrified villagers they'd encountered hours ago, their eyes wide with a fear that went beyond the usual horrors of war. He glanced at his driver, Private Kowalski, a burly Pole whose family had been uprooted by the war. Kowalski's jaw was set, his gaze fixed on the narrow dirt track winding through the valley. He'd been unusually subdued since they'd crossed the border, his usual stream of nervous chatter replaced by a grim determination. "Keep your eyes peeled, Kowalski," Jack said, his voice softer this time. "This place feels off." Kowalski nodded, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He'd seen enough of what men could do to each other. He knew the look of a place that held its breath. The valley began to widen, revealing a cluster of stone buildings nestled against the base of a sheer cliff face. It was a village, or what remained of one. Smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys, a stark contrast to the scorched earth they'd been traversing. It looked peaceful. Too peaceful. "Hold up, boys," Jack ordered, his hand hovering over the intercom button. "Let's take a look." He signaled to the tanks behind them, a string of olive-drab beasts lumbering through the dust. Through the periscope, Jack scanned the village. No panicked civilians fleeing, no Wehrmacht soldiers marching in formation. Just a few figures moving slowly in the distance, their movements unhurried, almost languid. It was eerie. "Looks like we've found ourselves some friendly faces, Sarge," Miller said, a hint of relief in his voice. Jack didn't share the sentiment. "Don't get comfortable, Miller. Something's not right." He keyed the intercom again. "Sergeant Henderson, take your platoon and sweep the perimeter, cautiously. I want eyes on everything. Kowalski, bring us in slow and steady. Let's see who's home." The Sherman rumbled forward, its tracks kicking up a fine dust. As they approached the village square, a few figures emerged from the shadows of the buildings. They were dressed in civilian clothes, but there was a strange uniformity to them, a lack of expression on their faces that was unsettling. They didn't wave, didn't shout, didn't even seem to register the imposing metal behemoths rolling into their midst. A woman, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, stepped forward. Her eyes, a startlingly pale blue, met Jack's through the periscope. There was no fear in them, no welcome, just a blank, unsettling calm. "Halt!" Jack shouted, his voice amplified by the external speaker. "We are American forces. We are here to liberate you." The woman didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head, a gesture that was more analytical than curious. A small group of men joined her, their faces equally devoid of emotion. They stood there, a silent tableau, as the tanks surrounded the square. "This is getting weirder by the minute, Sarge," Miller muttered. Jack felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. He was a soldier. He understood fear, anger, desperation. He understood the raw, visceral emotions that war unleashed. But this was something else. It was a void. "Henderson, anything?" Jack asked, his voice tight. "Negative, Sarge. Perimeter clear. No sign of enemy troops. But the villagers are acting strange, like they're drugged or something." Drugged? Jack's mind raced. What kind of holdout would involve drugging an entire village? It didn't make sense. Unless the village wasn't the target. Unless it was a veil. "Kowalski, keep the engine running," Jack ordered. "Miller, keep your gun trained on the square. I'm going to have a closer look." He unlatched the hatch, the sudden influx of fresh air a welcome relief from the tank's confines. He climbed out, his M1 Garand rifle held at the ready. The villagers watched him, their eyes tracking his movements with an unnerving stillness. He approached the woman who had first stepped forward. "Can you understand me?" he asked, his voice firm. She nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "Where are the German soldiers?" Jack pressed. "We know there are still some in this area." Her pale blue eyes seemed to drift past him, as if she were looking at something far beyond the village square. "They are gone," she said, her voice a low, monotone whisper. "Gone where?" Jack insisted, his patience wearing thin. "This is the end of the war. They should be surrendering." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, a chilling sight given the circumstances. "The war is not over," she said. "Not for them, and not for us." Jack felt a cold dread wash over him. The words, so calmly spoken, held a weight that was far heavier than any battlefield pronouncement. He looked at the other villagers, their faces a sea of passive acceptance. They weren't victims. They were complicit. "What do you mean?" Jack demanded, his grip tightening on his rifle. Before she could answer, a faint rhythmic thrumming began to emanate from somewhere deeper within the village. It was a low, mechanical hum, growing steadily louder, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. The villagers didn't react, but Jack's men tensed. "Sarge, what is that?" Miller's voice crackled over the intercom, laced with a new kind of apprehension. Jack scanned the village, his eyes drawn to a large barn-like structure at the far end of the square. The thrumming seemed to be coming from inside. A heavy wooden door, previously unseen, was now slowly creaking open. And from the darkness within, a single, blinding beam of light sliced through the afternoon sky. It wasn't the sun. It was artificial, intensely bright, and it pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. "Get back in the tanks, boys!" Jack yelled, his voice a raw command. "We've stumbled into something big." As the lead tank, his own Sherman, began to reverse, the rhythmic thrumming intensified. The beam of light widened, revealing not a simple barn, but a vast, gaping maw of metal and concrete, a structure that had been cleverly concealed, its entrance now a gaping wound in the side of the cliff. The villagers remained rooted to the spot, their pale eyes fixed on the light, a disconcerting serenity on their faces as the American tanks, their engines roaring, scrambled to regroup. The whispers of the terrified villagers, the unsettling quiet, the blank stares. They all coalesced into a horrifying realization. This wasn't just a hidden village. This was the heart of something far more sinister. The Doomsday plan, it seemed, was not to be detonated in a fiery blast, but to be unleashed from the silent, hidden depths of the Austrian Alps. The rhythmic thrumming intensified, a low, guttural pulse that vibrated through the very bones of the M4 Sherman. Sergeant Jack Riley gripped the commander's hatch, his knuckles white against the cool metal. The blinding beam of light, emanating from the gaping maw within the cliff face, sliced through the twilight like a surgical instrument. It was impossibly bright, an artificial sun that defied the natural order of the dying day. "What in God's name is that, Sarge?" Miller's voice crackled over the intercom, laced with a disbelief that mirrored Jack's own. "I don't know, Miller, but it ain't friendly." Jack scanned the faces of the villagers. They stood at the edge of the open space, a silent, unmoving tableau, their expressions eerily blank. The woman with the pale blue eyes, the one who'd spoken with such chilling detachment, remained at the forefront, her gaze fixed on the light, as if mesmerized. There was no fear, no curiosity, not even a flicker of recognition of the immense, unnatural phenomenon unfolding before them. It was as if they were observing a common occurrence, like the setting of the sun or the falling of rain. Private Kowalski, his Polish heritage etched into the grim lines of his face, had stopped the lead tank, the ironclad, a few yards from the opening. The other Shermans of his platoon, Hellbender and Bulldog, held their positions behind him, their massive forms dark against the deepening shadows. The mechanical hum of their engines, usually a comforting sound of power, now seemed to underscore the unnerving silence of the valley. "Getting weirder by the second, Sarge," Kowalski muttered, his voice tight. "This ain't right. Not right at all." Jack nodded, though Kowalski couldn't see him. He felt it too, a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with the lingering threat of the Wehrmacht or the SS. This was a different kind of dread, a primal fear that whispered of things beyond the scope of conventional warfare. The sheer scale of the concealed structure, the unyielding metal and concrete that had been so expertly hidden, spoke of a level of planning and execution that chilled him to the bone. "Miller, keep your eyes peeled. Kowalski, you ready to move if I give the word?" Jack's voice was low, steady, an attempt to project a calm he didn't entirely feel. "Ready, Sarge," Miller replied, his voice tight. "Always, Sarge," Kowalski confirmed. The beam of light pulsed, a slow, deliberate beat that seemed to synchronize with the thrumming. It illuminated the interior of the cavernous opening, revealing not machinery as Jack might have expected, but a vast, echoing space that stretched into darkness beyond the reach of the light. It looked like a cathedral dedicated to some unholy purpose. "What are they trying to do?" Miller's question hung in the air, unanswered. Jack scanned the cliff face, searching for any sign of activity, any telltale movement that might betray the nature of this hidden installation. He saw nothing. The villagers remained still, their impassive faces turned towards the light. Then, a subtle shift. A section of the cavern floor, still bathed in the blinding beam, began to move. It wasn't a gradual ascent, but a smooth, almost liquid glide, as if the very ground were parting. Jack squinted, trying to make out what was emerging. It was large, impossibly large, and dark. "Sarge, look!" Miller yelled, his voice now sharp with alarm. A colossal object, a dark, angular shape, was rising from the depths. It was unlike any weapon Jack had ever seen or imagined. It was too streamlined, too alien, and it dwarfed the Shermans. The thrumming intensified, a deafening roar now, and the beam of light seemed to bend and warp around the rising object. "Get ready to move!" Jack barked into the intercom, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could feel the vibrations through the tank's hull, a physical manifestation of the immense power being unleashed. This wasn't just a hidden bunker or a last-ditch arsenal. This was something else entirely. As the object fully emerged, Jack's breath hitched. It was a missile, he realized with a sickening lurch. But not just any missile. It was enormous, its hull a matte black that seemed to absorb the light. And atop it, glinting in the artificial sun, was a warhead that looked impossibly large, impossibly deadly. "It's a rocket, Sarge," Miller stammered, his usual bravado gone. "A hell of a big one." "That's no rocket I've ever seen," Jack retorted, his mind racing. This was a doomsday plan, all right. A plan to end the world, or at least a significant chunk of it. And these villagers, they were watching it happen with the same passive acceptance they'd shown everything else. The woman with the pale blue eyes finally moved. She raised a hand, not in alarm, but in a gesture that seemed almost like a blessing. The villagers mirrored her, their hands rising slowly, their faces still devoid of emotion. It was a silent benediction for the apocalypse. "Kowalski, get us out of here, now!" Jack's voice was a raw command. He didn't understand the full scope of what was happening, but he understood enough. He understood that they had stumbled upon a secret so profound, so terrifying, that it threatened to rewrite history. Kowalski didn't hesitate. The ironclad lurched forward, its tracks churning the damp earth. The other Shermans followed, their engines roaring in defiance of the thrumming. Jack risked a glance back. The colossal missile was now fully revealed, silhouetted against the dark interior of the cavern, its warhead pointed skyward. The beam of light intensified, a blinding beacon of destruction. "Sarge, they're not moving," Miller said, his voice strained. "The villagers, they're just standing there." Jack saw it too. The villagers, their hands still raised, were not fleeing. They were not cowering. They were simply waiting, as if they had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The ground beneath them began to shake. Not a violent tremor, but a deep, resonant vibration that grew steadily stronger. The missile began to ascend, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The thrumming reached an unbearable crescendo, a physical force that pressed against their eardrums. "Go, Kowalski, go!" Jack yelled, ducking back into the hatch, shielding his eyes from the blinding light. He heard the distinctive roar of the approaching missile, a sound that promised utter annihilation. He felt the ground heave beneath the tanks, the very air crackling with energy. Then, with a sound that ripped through the valley, a sound that was both a scream and a roar, the missile ignited. A gout of flame erupted from its base, illuminating the entire hidden valley in a searing white light. The force of the blast sent shockwaves rippling through the landscape, tossing the Shermans like toys. Jack felt the ironclad lurch violently. He was thrown against the side of the turret, his head striking the metal with a dull thud. For a moment, all he could hear was the deafening roar and the ringing in his ears. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for impact. When the shaking finally subsided and the deafening roar began to recede into the distance, Jack slowly opened his eyes. The air was thick with dust and smoke. The blinding beam of light from the cliff face was gone, replaced by the eerie glow of dying embers from what looked like a blast crater where the missile had been. He cautiously raised his head, peering out of the hatch. The village was still there, or what was left of it. Buildings that had stood moments before were now rubble. But the villagers, they were gone, vanished. The open space where they had stood, where they had raised their hands in silent benediction, was empty. The only evidence they had ever been there were the faint imprints of feet in the churned earth. "Miller, Kowalski, status report." Jack's voice was hoarse. I'm okay, Sarge," Miller replied, his voice shaky. "Tank's intact, just rattled." "Me too, Sarge," Kowalski added, his voice strained. "We're okay. But where did they go?" Jack scanned the desolate landscape. No sign of the villagers. No sign of the woman with the pale blue eyes. It was as if they had been consumed by the blast, or had simply walked into the earth. He looked at the cliff face. The gaping maw was still there, a dark, silent wound against the rock. But the thrumming was gone. The artificial light was gone. The Doomsday plan, whatever its intended target, had launched, but its architects and its silent witnesses had disappeared as mysteriously as they had appeared. "I don't know, Kowalski," Jack said, his gaze fixed on the empty space where the villagers had stood. "I don't know. But I've got a feeling we just saw the end of something. And maybe the beginning of something even worse." He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that this was not the end of their mission. The war might be over, but the secrets hidden in this forgotten fold of the Alps were far from revealed. They had stumbled upon a puzzle, a terrifying alien puzzle, and the pieces were scattered, lost in the smoke and dust of a Doomsday launched. He ordered his platoon to establish a perimeter around the hidden structure, a grim task for soldiers who had just witnessed the impossible. The metallic tang of sweat, the acrid scent of cordite, and the lingering, unsettling silence of a valley emptied of its inhabitants. These were the new companions of Sergeant Jack Riley and his men. They had come expecting a clean sweep, a final mop-up operation. Instead, they had found a gaping wound in reality, and the chilling certainty that some Doomsday plans, even if launched, might not truly end. They had a report to file, a report that would stretch the credulity of anyone who hadn't been there. A report of a hidden village, an apocalyptic missile, and a people who had vanished into the night, leaving behind only questions and the chilling echo of a plan that had almost ended the world. The roaring engines of the M4 Sherman, the ironclad, dwindled to a frantic thrumming as Jack slammed the hatch shut. The metallic tang of sweat and fear, a familiar scent of combat, clung to the air inside the cramped turret. Outside, the blinding beam of light, a malevolent finger pointing at the heavens, had vanished as abruptly as it had appeared, leaving only the bruised twilight sky as its testament. The rhythmic thrumming of the missile's launch, a sound that had vibrated through the very bedrock of the Alps, was gone, replaced by a silence so profound, so absolute, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the tank. "What the hell was that, Sarge?" Miller's voice, usually laced with a weary cynicism, was thin, strained. His knuckles were white where he gripped the intercom. Jack didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the cliff face, on the spot where the gaping maw of the hidden structure had been. Now it was just rock, indistinguishable from the rest of the scarred mountainside. The woman, the villagers, they had been there, watching, and then they weren't. Vanished. Like smoke in a sudden gust of wind. The sheer impossibility of it gnawed at him. He'd seen plenty of horrors in this war, enough to curdle the blood and haunt his sleep. But this was different. This was beyond the grim arithmetic of death and destruction. "Report, Miller," Jack finally barked, forcing a gruffness into his voice that didn't match the prickle of unease crawling up his spine. "Damage? Status?" "All clear, Sarge. Tracks are good. Armor's holding. We're intact." Miller's voice wavered. "Just what the hell was that thing?" "Don't know, Miller. Don't know." Jack's eyes scanned the village below. The stone houses, the empty market square, the impossibly pristine church steeple. It looked like a postcard, untouched by the war, untouched by the terrifying spectacle they had just witnessed. And yet, the villagers were gone. Every single one. The passive faces, the unnerving calm, the whispered promises that the war wasn't over. It all coalesced into a single, chilling realization. They hadn't been hiding from the war. They had been part of this. "Kowalski, you see anything?" Jack's voice crackled through the intercom to the driver. "Nothing, Sarge. Just empty. Like the whole damn place packed up and left." Kowalski's Polish accent was thicker than usual, a sign of his agitation. "The woman. She said they would vanish. Said they always do." Jack's gut tightened. Always do. The words echoed in his mind. This wasn't a one-off event. This was a ritual, a departure, and he and his crew had stumbled right into the middle of it. He thought of the woman's pale blue eyes, devoid of fear, devoid of anything at all. They had looked at him, at the ironclade, not with surprise or terror, but with a strange, almost detached curiosity, as if he were a specimen under glass. "Miller, get your binoculars. Scan the tree line, the approaches. Anything out of the ordinary," Jack ordered, his mind racing. They had to get out of here. Report this. But to whom? And how do you explain a vanishing village and a doomsday missile launched by... whom? Not the Wehrmacht, not the SS. This felt older, alien. Miller grunted, the scrape of metal as he adjusted the binoculars audible. "Just trees, Sarge, and more trees. Looks like we're the only ones left in this forgotten fold in the Alps." "Good. Kowalski, let's move. Slow and steady. We're heading back the way we came." Jack's hand hovered over the radio handset, but he hesitated. What would he even say? "Houston, we have a problem. The local population is dematerialized, and their pet Doomsday rocket just took off." They'd think he'd cracked under the strain. Every soldier deserved a break after years of war, but this wasn't the kind of break anyone wanted. As the ironclad lumbered forward, its treads crunching on the gravel path that led out of the village, Jack kept his eyes glued to the rear-view periscope, then to the main viewports. The village remained eerily still. No faces peered from windows, no figures emerged from doorways. It was as if the entire population had been erased from existence. The air, which had been thick with the metallic tang of their own fear, now held a different kind of stillness. A chilling emptiness that spoke of something profound and unsettling having just concluded. They drove for what felt like hours, the landscape slowly shifting from the stark, dramatic beauty of the high Alps to the softer rolling hills that marked the descent. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a stark contrast to the grim tableau they had left behind. The rhythmic thrumming of the tank's engine was a comforting sound, a tangible presence in the encroaching darkness. It was the sound of moving, of escaping, of returning to the world of the living. Miller broke the silence again, his voice still hushed. "You think anyone's gonna believe us, Sarge?" Jack grunted, his gaze fixed on the winding dirt road ahead. "We tell them what we saw, Miller. That's all we can do. A hidden missile, a vanishing village. They can believe it or not. We saw it. But that woman, she said they'd vanished, like it was normal. And that missile, it wasn't like anything I've ever seen. Not ours, not theirs. It was too smooth, too perfect." Miller shivered, despite the warmth inside the tank. "I know," Jack said, his voice low. He remembered the almost serene expression on the woman's face as she watched the monstrosity ascend. It wasn't fear, or triumph, or even curiosity. It was acceptance, as if this was the natural order of things. Kowalski, usually so stoic, let out a ragged sigh. It was the kind of place that held its breath, Sarge. Always knew something was wrong, even before the big light show. The quiet, it wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. Jack nodded, the word waiting resonating deeply. They had been waiting. Waiting for the war to end? Or waiting for something else entirely? The missile, the Doomsday plan, as the initial intel had hinted, felt like a desperate, last-gasp effort. But by whom, and for what purpose? The sheer scale of the operation, the hidden launch site, the technological sophistication. It spoke of resources and planning that went far beyond the beleaguered Nazi regime in its final days. As they crested a hill, the first distant glow of a German farmhouse, still standing and unscarred, appeared on the horizon. A sign of civilization. A sign that the war, for all its lingering horrors, was indeed drawing to a close. But for Jack, the war had just taken a terrifying new turn. They had stumbled into a secret, a dark undercurrent of the conflict that went far beyond the familiar enemy. "We're almost to the rendezvous point," Jack announced, his voice regaining some of its usual command. "Miller, get ready to make contact. Kowalski, keep your eyes peeled. This road's been quiet, but that doesn't mean it's safe." The thought of making contact with his commanding officer, of trying to articulate the impossible events of the past few hours, felt overwhelming. How could he convey the unsettling calm of the villagers, the sheer, terrifying power of the launched weapon, the chilling finality of their disappearance? It sounded like the ramblings of a shell-shocked soldier. But the image of that beam of light, cutting through the twilight, and the subsequent silence, was seared into his memory. They reached the designated clearing, a small muddy field where a jeep was already waiting, its engine idling. Lieutenant Evans emerged, a weary but familiar face. He approached the ironclad as it rumbled to a halt, his expression one of polite expectation. "Sergeant Riley," Evans greeted, his voice clipped. "Report. Anything to note on your sweep of the valley?" Jack swung open the hatch, the cool evening air hitting his face. He stepped down onto the damp earth, the familiar weight of his M1 Garand slung over his shoulder. Miller and Kowalski followed, their faces grim. "Lieutenant," Jack began, his voice rough, "we found something. Something significant." He paused, searching for the right words. "The village, it was empty. The inhabitants, they're gone. Vanished?" Evans blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Vanished, Sergeant? Are you sure? Perhaps they evacuated?" "No, sir. Not evacuated. Vanished. And we saw a missile launch, a big one, from a hidden facility in the cliffs. Nothing we've ever seen before. Not ours, not theirs." Jack met Evans's gaze directly. "Sir, I don't think this war is over." The lieutenant's brow furrowed. He looked from Jack to Miller and Kowalski, taking in their shaken expressions. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with disbelief and a dawning sense of dread. The war was supposed to be ending. Peace was on the horizon. But the hidden valley, with its spectral inhabitants and its terrifying doomsday weapon, had just revealed a chilling truth. Some secrets, once uncovered, could launch a new kind of war, one they were utterly unprepared for. The victory they had fought so hard for might have just unearthed a threat far greater than they could have ever imagined. The roar of the M4 Sherman's engine was a familiar comfort, a guttural promise of forward momentum against the surreal silence that had swallowed the Austrian village. Sergeant Jack Riley gripped the controls, his knuckles white against the worn metal, the phantom image of the villagers dissolving like smoke still seared behind his eyelids. It had been less than an hour since the blinding beam of light had erupted from the cliff face, since the ground had vibrated with a power that felt alien, and since the entire population of this forgotten fold in the Alps had simply ceased to be. "What the hell was that, Sarge?" Miller's voice crackled over the intercom, laced with a tremor that belied his usual bravado. He was in the turret, his M1 Garand resting on the ready, but even his practiced gaze had been unable to make sense of it. "Damned if I know, Miller," Jack replied, his own voice rough. He scanned the empty village square, the quaint stone houses now looking like tombstones. Not a soul stirred, no dogs barked. The wind, which had been a biting presence moments before, seemed to have died down to a whisper, as if holding its breath. "But I don't think we're going to find out by sticking around." Private Kowalski, his Polish heritage etched in the grim set of his jaw, kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead as he expertly navigated the tank through the deserted lanes. "It was not a bomb, Sergeant. Not like anything I have seen." He spoke with a quiet certainty that sent a fresh prickle of unease down Jack's spine. Kowalski had seen his share of destruction. Jack risked a glance back through the periscope. The cliff face where the missile had launched was now just a sheer rock wall, the gaping maw from which the unnatural light had speared into the heavens. Gone. It was as if the earth itself had sealed the wound, a perfect, seamless closure. He'd seen maps of this region, or rather, the lack of them. This valley was a blank spot, a place the Wehrmacht and even the SS seemed to have overlooked, or perhaps purposefully ignored. Now he understood why. "Miller, keep your eyes peeled. Kowalski, let's get back to the main road, fast as she'll go." Jack's instinct screamed at him to put distance between them and this place, this impossible event. The war was supposed to be winding down. VE Day was practically on their doorstep. Yet here they were, witnessing something that felt like the dawn of a new, terrifying kind of conflict. The tank's treads churned over the cobblestones, the rhythmic thrumming a stark contrast to the suffocating quiet. As they rumbled out of the village, Jack caught a glimpse of something on a windowsill. A single porcelain doll, its vacant blue eyes staring out from a faded lace dress. It was the only sign of life, or rather, of something that had been life, left behind. He'd seen that same unnerving placidity in the eyes of the villagers, a terrifying absence of fear, of pain, of anything at all. "Sarge, look!" Miller shouted, his voice tight. Jack swung the periscope around. A figure stood at the edge of the village, just beyond the last of the stone houses. It was the woman, the one who had spoken to him, her voice a monotone devoid of any emotion. She stood perfectly still, her dark skirt blending with the shadows of the trees, her pale blouse a beacon in the dim light. She wasn't moving, wasn't waving, wasn't running. She was just observing them leave. "Keep moving, Kowalski," Jack ordered, his voice low. He watched her through the periscope until the village was swallowed by the winding road. She remained a solitary, unsettling sentinel. He wondered if she was waiting for them to return, or if she was simply a marker, a silent testament to whatever had transpired. The journey back felt longer, each mile a desperate attempt to outrun the unsettling questions. The vibrant spring green of the Austrian countryside, so recently a welcome sight after weeks of dreary campaigning, now seemed muted, tinged with an unnatural pallor. The very air felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy. Jack found himself replaying the woman's words. "The war is not over for us." He'd dismissed it as propaganda, the desperate clinging to a lost cause. But the missile, that wasn't propaganda. That was something else entirely. They reached their predetermined rendezvous point, a small clearing near the main road, where Lieutenant Davies and the rest of their platoon were waiting. The sight of their familiar olive-drab beasts, the M4 Shermans, brought a small measure of relief. But it was short-lived. The tension radiating from Jack's crew was palpable. "Riley, what happened? You're an hour late," Davies called out, his voice sharp with concern. He was a young lieutenant, eager to prove himself, but Jack had always found him to be thorough and reliable. Jack killed the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening. He climbed out of the hatch, the metallic tang of sweat and gun oil suddenly cloying. He looked at Davies, at the anxious faces of the other soldiers, and for a moment, he couldn't find the words. How did you explain a disappearing village, a silent missile launch, and a people who vanished into thin air? "Sir," Jack began, his voice rough, "we found it. The village. It was strange." Davies's brow furrowed. "Strange how? Did you encounter resistance?" "No, sir. No resistance. The people, they were all there, but they acted like automatons. No fear, no expression. And then,